What's up, guys? I'm Chad Barnes, and welcome to the channel. Here, it's all about real car talk, from simple fixes to smart driving tips and keeping your ride in top shape. If that sounds good to you, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you watch all the way through. There's a lot of good stuff coming. Let's get to
an electric motor. Briefly recall what the starter is. The starter is an electromechanical device that serves to start an internal combustion engine. And the main part of this device is an ordinary electric motor. I will not describe the principle of its operation. I hope that everyone could finish school, and they're about the electric motor in physics classes told in detail. Cranking the crankshaft of an internal combustion engine with an electric motor is not all you need for a successful start. There is a small difficulty. The crankshaft to start the motor must be cranked to at least 100 revolutions per minute, for which the starter pinion must make approximately 1,000 revolutions. After starting the engine, the crankshaft rotates at an average speed of about 1,000 revolutions, and in frost, and more, with the starter pinion, being in mesh with the flywheel crown, will spin up to 10,000 revolutions. The starter will simply collapse from such a speed of rotation of the armature, rotor. Therefore, this electric motor has one more detail, an overrunning clutch, which is called a bendix. It is simple. Two bushings when turning on the starter are wedged by rollers on springs, and after starting the motor, when the speed of the gear becomes greater than the speed of rotation of the electric motor rotor, the rollers can no longer wedge the bushing, so that the motor is unable to transfer rotation to the starter rotor. Maybe it sounds complicated in words, but in fact the device that disconnects the starter from the motor is elementary. The next necessary part of the starter is the retractor relay, solenoid. It performs several functions at once. Immediately after the current supply, the solenoid through the plug brings the bendix to the flywheel crown, and then through copper contacts, nickels, turn on the electric motor itself. Thus the retracting relay not only provides connection of the bendix with the flywheel, but also relieves the contact group of the ignition switch. The starting current is very high, about 400 A, so if it were not for the relay, the life of the ignition switch would not be too long. After the engine is started, the driver releases the key, or button. The voltage on the retractor relay is lost and the spring returns its core to its place. This opens the contacts of the electric motor, and the bendix moves away from the flywheel crown. Theoretically, everything is quite simple. There are, however, some other types of starters. For example, the starters of old cars did not have a retractor relay, so the starter was activated by the pedal, roughly speaking. The driver's foot replaced this relay, pushing the bendix and closing the starter contacts by pressing the pedal. And there is also an inner starter, in fact, a DC generator, standing directly on the crankshaft, or a pneumatic starter. But this is not our topic. What can go wrong? Let's consider two classic situations. The starter does not work cold and the starter does not work hot. Cold, since the starter is an electric motor. Nothing electric motor is alien to it. Of course, we are talking about a bad contact. As I said before, the starter draws a lot of current, especially on diesel cars, whose engines are more difficult to turn because of the higher compression ratio, and therefore compression and compression resistance. Not in vain, for example, on the early MAZ200 with 12-volt equipment, the starter still worked from 24 volts when starting the engine. Two 12-volt batteries were connected in series. However, this scheme was later abandoned and this MAZ was switched to 24 volts completely, but still. So, bad contact. The first thing to check is the mass and the thick plus wire going to the starter. In extreme case, you can try to turn on the starter voluntarily and forcibly by closing the contacts on the retractor relay with a suitable iron. The main thing is not to short the plus to the starter mass. If the starter during this procedure came to life, then, most likely, it is the wiring to it that is to blame. I will not talk about the fact that the cause of complete silence of the starter can be a discharged battery. It is quite elementary. The next common cause of starter failure to turn a cold motor is wear and tear of the electric motor itself. As a rule, brushes or armature windings. In addition, the windings may be shorted. There is a way to check this problem without removing the starter. It is enough to bruise the starter with something heavy enough. If it works after that, it is almost certainly time to change the brushes. If the car is old, the starter may stop working due to the accumulation of wear products of brushes or other dust and dirt, which still get into it during operation. Sometimes it is enough just to clean it well, and it will work again. However, not for a long time, so if the starter is removed from the car, it does not hurt to carry out its detailed defect inspection, so as not to remove it every 2 weeks. Less likely, but also a frequent problem, is the wear of the Bendix. Over time, the rollers of its mechanism wear out, become thinner and are no longer able to wedge the bushing. Usually in this case, the starter turns, but does not turn the flywheel. The sound is characteristic. It is difficult to make a mistake. However, almost the same sound will produce a starter in which there are mechanical problems that do not allow to bring the Bendix to the flywheel. For example, the fork is broken or badly worn. Or maybe there is a malfunction in the retractor relay. Most likely, it will be easier to remove the starter, disassemble it and check the condition of all elements. You can guess here for a long time. The most exotic cause of starter silence is a stator magnet malfunction. Well, as a malfunction, they sometimes just fall off. For example, Belarusian starters, which are on many of our VAZ cars, are guilty of this. Theoretically, a magnet that has fallen off can be glued back onto the stator with ordinary superglue. But it is important not to confuse the polarity of the magnets. By the way, those who like to reanimate the starter with a hammer, see above paragraph about worn brushes, these magnets fly off much faster. And if they are already glued by someone with superglue, it should be remembered that after drying this glue usually becomes brittle. And repair of the starter with a hammer with the application of force to the stator is guaranteed to cause the magnet to lose its place. So you should not get carried away with this, and if you have started repairing the stator, check the brushes as well. Let's move on to the second part of the Malson ballet, the starter's failure to work on a hot engine. Strange as it may seem, but we have to start again with the wiring. Probably, somewhere the contact may be gone due to a change in the temperature gap. Well, and the owners of Jiggly will remember that if this happens, it is necessary to clean or change the heels of the starter. After all, the temperature at sparking with such a current can reach up to 1,000 degrees, so that the contacts melt by hurrah. Well, or they can get stuck, which also happens. But the most common failure has a more complex and systemic nature. In short, it is a misalignment of the starter armature. It occurs due to wear of the armature support bushings, or bearing, if there is one. In this case, the armature is skewed, and the brushes can no longer fully adhere to the collector, and the armature itself can hit the stator magnets. And then the starter will consume a lot of current. You can melt the battery terminal or burn the plus wire that goes to the starter. The battery itself will be very strongly discharged at the time of the starter, and it will spin barely even with a live battery. This will require a fairly serious repair, replacement of brushes, armature bushings, and collector grinding. And if the starter is inexpensive, it will be easier to replace it with a new one. Of course, we are not talking about some foreign cars, spare parts for which are unreasonably expensive. There it makes sense to do the repair. And I repeat once again, do not try to save on matches. Everything that looks worn out should be replaced. If only for the reason that on some cars it is more difficult to remove and put the starter back than to give birth to a triplet in the field. Of course, with such repairs, it is desirable to check and all other mechanisms, the Bendix and the retractor relay. They are usually not repaired, but put new ones. There is nothing to repair. It is probably worth sharing one more observation. The starter rarely stops working immediately and completely. Usually, at first it gets lazy and lazy. It does not work the first time or starts to turn the engine slower. In this case, it is better to immediately think about its inevitable repair. If the starter stops working suddenly and immediately, you should first pay attention to the wiring. In addition, there are 2 more reasons why the starter does not work, although the starter itself may be quite serviceable. The first is a malfunction of the ignition switch. In it, the contact group burns up, and the lock simply stops turning on the starter. The second reason is wear of the flywheel crown. Of course, the life of the starter is almost always lower than that of the flywheel, but there are evil jokes in life. So if you hear a strange grinding or no engagement of the Bendix with the flywheel, it is not always the starter's fault. Well, if the teeth of the crown are badly crumbled or worn, they can kill the Bendix itself. In a neglected case, when they get tooth on tooth, the starter can burn out. So we have to remember that the starter is just an element of the starting and charging system, the condition of which should be monitored. No less carefully than the cooling system or brakes. Strange as it may seem, the car loves not only lubrication, but affection too. And at least a little attention from its owner. In conclusion, a malfunctioning starter can be a frustrating experience, but understanding the common reasons behind its failure can help you diagnose and repair the issue effectively. Whether it's a dead battery, faulty connections, or a worn-out starter motor, identifying the problem is the first step toward a solution. Remember to always prioritize safety and consult a professional if you're unsure about any repairs. With the right knowledge and tools, you can get your vehicle back on the road in no time. Thank you for watching, and we hope this guide has been helpful in addressing your starter issues.